Okay, bam, keep it started. Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and start off with board member introductions and then allow Prisca to introduce herself and allow everyone else to introduce themselves. So I guess I'll start. So I'm Dahlia. I'm Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion. I am in my last semester here at the RSJ, graduated in May, and I'm a journalism major with an emphasis in public relations and a minor in ethics.
I'm Jackie. I am the Vice President of Membership and Digital Communications this semester and of PRSSA. And it's my first semester here at UNR. And I'm majoring in journalism with an emphasis in visual communications. Switching my minor over to, I was going to do political science, but I decided social
Class.
Yeah.
I'm Theron Harper. I am the acting president of PRSSA this semester. I didn't plan to be, but I got shanghaied into the role, and it's been a lot of fun. But it's so busy, and I'm so happy to be graduating this semester in journalism as well, and a minor in environmental studies. And I'm that climate nerd that won't shut up at the party. Sorry. We're introducing the rest of our guests.
My name is Crystal Carter. I'm a journalism major with emphasis in visual communications, and my current minor is Arabic. And I want to add, I'm thinking about, even though I only have I would plan to graduate December 2023, but now I'm thinking I just really want to take my time to focus on Arabic, but also to add media and cinema studies to my major.
I'm Natasha Zinder. I'm majoring in psychology with an emphasis in research and in sociology and philosophy. And this is also my last semester. But terrifying.
Not nearly yet, right? You're going to come back and do masters and everything?
Yeah.
You're just getting started.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if Sonia's
Sonia, do you want to introduce yourself? If you're parked.
Hey y'all, sorry, I'm driving right now, but I'm Sonia, and let's see, I'm getting my master's in media innovation right now, and yeah, at the Reynolds School of Journalism. So thanks for having me, everybody.
Thank you for calling in. So I think you all know I'm Dr. Prisca Gayles. Please, for this event, just call me Prisca. It's nice and small and intimate. That's why I like things. I am a professor in the Department of Sociology and Gender, Race, and Identity. I teach courses on intersectionality, social movements theory, research methods. I designed recently a Black Studies minor, which will be rolling out in the fall, and so I'll be teaching some courses there on Afro-Latin studies and Black epistemology and ways of seeing, which take a transnational perspective. Yeah, should I just start, or do you want to?
Can you give us a little about your background and kind of how you ended up at UNR?
How I ended up at UNR. Okay, that's like the whole topic.
Okay.
That's what I will. Okay, yeah. So I'm going to go way back. I think when you asked me to do this talk, I was super excited. I was just on a talk this morning called Success in Latin American Studies. And so basically I did my PhD in Latin American Studies. And so I spoke to current doctoral students, master students, and prospective students at University of Texas at Austin about how to have a successful career at the doctoral level in Latin American Studies. And so one of the things that I kind of almost teared up is that a lot of folks said, oh, I wouldn't be at UT if I hadn't met Prisca. And so I'm like, there's this great program and you can get funding. And I would and then also one of my really good friends who was in my cohort said oh, Prisca went over all my job documents because and so people were like, Prisca, you're kind of like the connective link. And I don't think that's something that I do on purpose, but I think I would not be where I am today if I didn't have people who went out on a limb for me. And so I don't even do it as a return, but I think something that's intrinsic to my being is I can help someone achieve their goal anyway. I'm here for it. So my background. And so why was it so important for me to have that support? When I know the title of the talk is going for the doctorate as a woman of color, but I'm not only a woman of color, I am also first gen. I also come from a working class background. And so all of those things played into me being terrified of even undergraduate studies. I grew up in West Oakland. Very few people even graduated high school where I lived, and so I never thought about college growing up. Another thing that I think in the last 2 years I've come to talk more about, I think first it was traumatic for me to share this story, but I grew up in what people would call the cult. So I did not have any formal schooling until I was 12 years old. And so a number of students, like when something would happen and a family would leave, you'd hear all these like stories about a family that left this so-called church. And most of the students who left tested well below their grade levels. And so that was something my mom had always cultivated, like a desire and a passion for knowledge in us. She always read to us. She taught me like bank finance when I was like very young. I remember that. So I think my mom is a huge part of my success. But I remember me just saying to my mom, like, I love studying and I don't feel like I'm getting the opportunity. And that was part of the reason why we left a pretty constricting place. And so the Gayles kids were considered geniuses there. And when we left, we were one of the few families that actually just tested to our grade level. And that was because our mom was also self-teaching us at home. And I shared that because I think it's an additional layer of the challenge that I had of also being first gen of, I was always scared of public or even just formal schooling because it was something that I didn't experience until I was 13 years old. So how did I get here? So when, as I said, my mom was just like one of the hardest working people. Like people say like my mom broke her back. For me, she literally, like, my mom is disabled today, and it's because she worked 3 and 4 and 5 jobs so she could put us through private school. I think she was, on the one hand, growing up in West Oakland, where we lived, the schools were not that great, and she wanted us to have, I think she saw this potential for, if you are ever in a family a family gathering, we're debating like crazy about black holes, about politics, and so we all love that. 3 of us have PhDs, 2 have masters, and this is, I said, we're all first gen. We all grew up very poor, and we didn't have formal schooling for the first half of our lives. And so a lot of that was my mom, but hi, come on. Yes. So I really discredit my mom because she worked very hard. She humbled herself to ask for help when she needed to, so we could go to private school. And so that's, high school was the first time I even thought like, okay, college is a possibility. And even growing up, we didn't have a TV. We had a TV, but we didn't have cable growing up, so we could get PBS. That was about it. So even a lot of people talk about like, oh, the Cosby Show, seeing that, a black middle class family going to college. Like, I didn't even see some of that stuff until college or high school. And so for me, I think it was really my mom. And then once I started high school, I went to a private all-girls school. And then the counselor said, where are you thinking about going to college? And I was like, I don't think I can, and so that kind of started it. And so I'll kind of skip ahead. So I ended up going to the University of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. I grew up in West Oakland. And one of my reasons for that is that I realized that because of my background and because I was this person who was very curious, because my mom traveled, here my mom comes in like on so many levels. She traveled when she was young, and she would tell us all these stories about traveling in France or traveling in the UK. And so I just thought, I want to go far away from home. I want to do something that's new and unknown for me. And so in hindsight, that was not a good idea.
I think a lot of people want to do that.
Out-of-state tuition is not fun. And so I ended up having to work multiple jobs during undergrad, but even that became a learning experience. So one of the things that happened, I'm fast forwarding a lot, but through my undergraduate experience, I think my mom not only instilled in me this desire for knowledge, but also this knowledge in terms of what we can read in books, but also in terms of what we could experience, right? And so that's why I've always wanted to have experiences that were outside of my comfort zone. I was like, okay, I'm going across the country to Pennsylvania for college, even if it means that I don't get to see my family because we can't necessarily afford a flight, back for whatever reason. There came an opportunity to study abroad in Cuba. Yes. At that time, I was majoring in Spanish with a certificate in Latin American Studies. I had no idea where I would study abroad, but I read a lot about Cuba, and I was really interested in ideals of like communitarianism and socialism, and like what that might look like in a place that it didn't work, but for a time it did work, right? And so that opportunity kind of started and planted the seeds of where I am now. And I should say that one of the reasons why I was majoring in Spanish and Latin American Studies is in high school I had a knack for languages, and I could learn languages really fast. So by the time I started college, I was already taking advanced level Spanish classes. So then I moved to Cuba for a semester, and I was studying at that time the philosophy of Jose Marti. So a lot of people study Jose Marti for the kind of the political texts and essays that he wrote. But Jose Marti was also a poet, and I was really interested in not only poetry, but also Latin American surrealism. So I was reading a lot of the authors from Latin America. And so I went to Cuba to take an intensive course on Jose Marti, along with a linguistics course and the society course. You know, the courses you need to fill the rest of what you're doing abroad. Also a huge proponent of studying abroad. And I had a very interesting experience because the police would stop me almost every day. I studied abroad with 9 peers, also from the University of Pittsburgh, all of whom were white. And so when they would stop me, they would say, "Señora, muéstrame el carnet," which means like, "Show me your ID. What are you doing with this people?" And they thought I was a Cuban person trying to like heckle or take advantage of tourists. So that was my experience. I also danced a lot of my life, and so I ended up joining a competitive dance team at the University of Havana. And it was actually outside of the university that we'd have these conversations, and they'd say, "Well, yes, for a time racism didn't exist here, but it does, and that's why this is happening to you." And then I remember Carlos, who was like kind of founded the dance group, was like, "Oh, just really make your accent like really big." And then we just like, "Oh, disculpa, officer, no sabía." And he was like, "Just really make really your accent really bad Spanish." Just like really bad. That's what they told me. They were like, and they would leave you alone. And so like, cause it would happen like we were at the beach, we would go like on vacation on the weekends. And so, but I think that experience, I thought, this is something that all of my classes where I was learning about Cuba, we didn't ever really talk about. I think today, because in the last 30 years, after Latin American studies has exploded, you could find a number of texts on Black experiences in Cuba and all over Latin America. My research is in Argentina. And so coming back, talking about that experience, people were like, "Oh, I didn't know there was racism in Cuba." But what was even more interesting to me is people would say, "I didn't know there were Black people in Cuba. This is an island that most of the population is Afro-descendant. You know, it's not everyone self-identifies as Black." And so I think for that, you know, I always talk about this desire for knowledge, but also like, and this is why I talk, this is not why, but I think one of the reasons why you can find my siblings and I arguing about Black holes is we like to try to like push the boundaries of knowledge when we are studying. And so for me, I had to not only be able to tell people, yes, Black people do exist in Cuba. Yes, they do experience racism in Cuba, but I wanted to approach that from a scholarly place. I wanted to do research. That was my how did I end up in Argentina and here? So I applied for a master's, and I had every intention of going back to Cuba to continue that work, or to continue the research or study I was doing there. But I went to school in Florida, and unbeknownst to me, it's a good program. My brother's currently a professor there too.
Florida leaves a bad taste in my mouth, that's all.
I went to the University of South Florida in Tampa. And I did not know that you cannot use any federal or state funds to study abroad in Cuba. It has to do with, it's a very long history that I don't have time to kind of elaborate on here, but it has to do with kind of the Miami Cuban political force and wanting to like, you know, destabilize the government there, but you can't use state or federal funds to study abroad. And I had every intention of completing my master's thesis on rumba groups in Cuba. So I also danced with the rumba group. And so I thought I have to do something else. What am I going to do? And I am already, you know, a semester into this master's program. And then the director of my program said, "Well, you did excellent in the human rights class. Why don't you come to Argentina with me as you can be like the graduate resident and help you with the cost," because I couldn't afford the cost. That will help you with the cost. You can use the rest of your scholarship to cover it, and you can study human rights. And I thought, okay, but this is kind of like, I wrote a proposal for graduate school talking about the experience of Africans in Latin America. How will this work, right? And she found an internship for me with the Center for Afro-Argentine Studies at the University of Plata, which is a province just outside of Buenos Aires. And that was the kickstart of my full research. I won't spend too much time on that, but I started to meet some of the activists. And I was initially doing a program, a historiography project called The African Roots of the Tango. So I was like in archives, having asthma attacks, looking through newspapers from the 1900s to like catalog Black tango composers and singers and dancers or songs that mentioned Black Argentines. And so when we put that exhibit on, that exhibit traveled to a number of university museums. Black Argentines or Afro-descendants who lived in Argentina will come to the presentation. And so I met one person who started talking to me about it, who said, wow, like this is, somebody actually is acknowledging this. And he said, we've been trying to get people to acknowledge our existence for years. And that kind of started my research into Black. And so that's how I ended up here. And I said I was going to wrap up with like going for the doctorate. How did I go from? One of the things, as a student who was first gen, like I didn't have a lot of knowledge about how to do that. And so I always talk about the importance of not only like your traditional styles of mentorship, but intergenerational mentorship, right? So my sister, who is 1 year older than me and got a full scholarship to do her PhD at Penn State, was like, okay, here's what I know about the process. Here's what you're gonna need to have in order. And just kind of, and so like, it started with her, but then my sister had friends who she went to San Diego State with who were like, oh yes, I'll look at your college application. And so that intergenerational mentorship was something that I would not have survived without, because my parents, as far as my mom took me, she had, there's some things like applying to graduate school, something she had never done. And so, she took me as far and gave me the tools, and then it was kind of finding those networks to like get to where I am today. So I will let you ask me the questions.
Okay. Well, first I want to open up the floor to anyone else that may have questions. So,
But how did you go from Argentina back to you came here? That whole background was like, wait a minute. Now I feel like you jumped a step.
So I was actually, I did my doctorate, I finished my master's thesis, and I wanted to continue the research. One of the reasons that I wanted to continue the research was I have always wanted to be a teacher. I didn't know what that looked like. I had the opportunity at the University of Pittsburgh to do an internship where I taught elementary school, middle school, and high school students, and I was like, all of this is very hard. They're throwing paper balls at me. But I still love it, But there's something.
Barely stop at college.
Verbal insults and all.
Yeah. And so it's interesting because even that experience, there were 7 of us, I think, or I forget how many. There was a number of us interns that we would meet, because they would have to debrief us, and so you're college students teaching a lesson. We would teach one lesson that entire class in public primary, middle, and high schools in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I felt like the thing that bothered me the most was not the paper balls, or not the all of the other things that come along with teaching, at the primary and secondary level. It was that I wanted to have a deeper conversations with the students, but how could I expect them to be able to unpack? So one of the lessons I taught, so this project was through the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. And it was bringing a cultural component to language classes in public schools. And so I taught a piece on the history of capoeira, which is interesting because it's Brazilian Portuguese, the class was Spanish, but it was like anything from Latin America you can teach on it. So I taught one on the history of lucha libre in Mexico, and then one on capoeira in Brazil. And I kind of designed this course that talks about the history of capoeira developing as a martial art that was disguised as a dance that enslaved people in Brazil used to hide their training to defend themselves. And I couldn't, they said, oh no, this is way too deep. Just a video, talk about the beating bell, talk about the whole and then go move on. And so you can't talk about it. And I'm like, but so much of what capoeira is like, it's not just a dance, it's rooted in these histories, right? And I think from that moment on, I wanted to be able to engage with students with questions that make us uncomfortable, that make us think outside of learning as fun, but learning as like grappling with something and like, if that makes sense. So when I applied for a doctorate in Latin American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, on the one hand, I wanted to continue I wanted to teach, but on the other hand, I saw that as a means because the University of Texas's program in Latin Studies, American Studies is so strong, and I should mention, very importantly, it's very well funded. I knew that I would be able to continue to go to Argentina and not only to do my research, but like one of the most fun things that I did was volunteering with Abubasen Chango, which is a Black youth empowerment group, like teaching English or teaching classes, building workshops on how to braid your hair, or even just going to Argentina, and I would go in one suitcase and the other suitcase would just have Black hair products and makeup because Black women can't find that there. And it was so important that I could bring that, you know? So that was part of my, you know, there was this, I don't even know how to describe it, but it was so much more than beyond the intellectual or scholarly questions that I had, where I had to keep going back. And I even talk about how, in the other talk I gave today, some of the students asked, you know, how did you come to develop your dissertation question? And it was actually, I developed that question in tandem with the people I were working with there. And I had to like, then I went back and then, you know, in classes at UT, they would say, oh, this is not, you know, you gotta change it, it's not research, this is not like research oriented enough, right? And so it was like, what do we want to study? And then how can we study that together? And so that was UT. How did I end up at the University of Nevada, Reno? Fast forward, I got a scholarship to do it was like a pre-doc postdoc at Williams College, where I got to only teach one class per year and just focus on my research. Focus on the job market. And so I started applying for jobs. When I left California in 2001, I thought, I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna teach at UCSF, UC Berkeley, Merritt College. I was like, it has to be the East Bay because that's my home and I have to go back there. As I became an adult, I realized that living there is not very feasible without a lot of resources already. And so long ago, and also just like, you know, learning about academia through conferences, through going to different schools, I was like, okay, I don't actually have to be in one place because I learned to appreciate the world outside of myself. And so I applied for a job here. One of the things that drew me to the job was, it seemed like it was written for me. It was sociology and like African diaspora studies. It was looking at someone who does work that's international. There's that joint position. I was trained in sociology through the Latin American Studies program, I should say that. But the job seemed like it was written for me. When I came for the interview, I got back and I had a very successful job market. I think at one point I was on and off of planes for 2 weeks straight for interviews. So I did have quite a number of offers. And after coming here, I said, University of Nevada, Reno is a dream job that I never knew was my dream job. Like just meeting with the people in my departments. Growing up, I volunteered as a camp counselor for kids with asthma, and so I got the chance to come to Tahoe. It was like that was the farthest I'd ever been from home as a kid. Was the 3 weeks in the summer that I spent with an asthma camp at Tahoe. I didn't even realize how close it was to California at the time, but I thought it was like this secret paradise, beautiful place in that. And so that I love being outdoors. And so I guess it was a good thing that I came here because I started during the pandemic. And so the entire first like 6 months I was here, I just hiked every weekend. I didn't know anyone and it kept me sane. So there was a number of things that came into play that I wasn't necessarily even looking for when I looked for a job, but that I was like, this is for
Thank you for coming. Does anyone else have any questions you want to ask before I ask some questions?
Yeah, I do. So how do you navigate what you want to study? Because it seems like you studied a lot, and that's kind of my issue now is that I've always wanted to study a lot, and I plan on seeing that through. So like, how did you see it and focus it?
Especially with that international focus, right? You're doing the Arabic studies. So one of the things that I did is, and I think I did not plan to talk about this, but it comes back to my mom. My mom taught me like how to humble yourself and ask for help. And so what that meant for me is that meeting that I had with the director of my program saying, hi, I'm glad for everything you all have given me, but I am poor and I cannot study abroad. the business master's if I can't use my scholarship to go to Cuba. And it was like, oh, come to Argentina with me. And it was like, my scholarship is that much. It's not going to cover a flight to South America. You know? So it's like, well, I can do this, this, and this, right? And oh, and have you seen this scholarship to apply for, right? So I think one of the things of navigating is community, right? And so that can exist on so many levels. So what community looked like for me, and this is throughout all of my projects, is that there's various communities. There's the community that I have that's going to help me survive what I don't know about academia, because it was very foreign to me for quite some time, right? And so even if it's only one or two professors, like my dissertation advisor was like, let me see your job docs, let me see your offer letter, let me see your negotiation letter, right? To have even if it's just one or two people who can do that, it starts with reaching out to a professor who you might be scared to approach, but if they're anything like me, and I think there's quite a few of us out there, they will be more than happy to help you try to navigate the ropes. But there's also the community that helps you. So there's one that helps you survive with, like, giving you the ins and outs. And there's also the community that helps you survive by being your outlet, right? And so for me, it depended on where I was. So in Cuba, it was the dance group that I danced with, right? At UT, it was a 2-hour bike ride on weekends with a friend, and then going to Cumbia and then having tacos after on Sundays, right? That ended up being the friends I did that with, ended up being the group that I ended up writing grants with. We went through grants together, right? So I think both inside of the institution and outside, you need a community that helps you, because sometimes it's going to be too much right here. And so we need that. And I think that's why it's been so hard during the pandemic, but to have that, let's get together and cook and put on, I told them before about all of the things that I had in my, if I love to cook. In our dorm, and oh my God, my friends, I cannot wait to see them. I'll get to see them for the first time in a few years, in a couple months. But we had a George Foreman in our dorm. We would just make stuff like quesadillas, margaritas. We would and so that we would cook together on the weekends, and that was our thing. And we had a dining card. We lived in a dorm, but it was just so much fun to cook. And so I had a friend who has Polish. One of my friends has a Polish and Irish background. One has an Italian background. But so one would be like, "Oh, my grandmother sent these Italian cookies," and that was part of my broadening my horizons, learning about. And so I remember one of my best friend's colleagues would make these, they're called Irish potatoes. And so she would do dessert, and then I would do if we were doing Taco Tuesdays, I would figure out how to do ground beef on a George Foreman. You can figure it out. So I do a patty so it doesn't fall off, and you take it off and you break it up. You microwave the taco seasoning with the water.
You gotta get really creative.
Yes, Taco Tuesdays, when she had these things called Irish potatoes, and they're it's a cream cheese and sugar, and then you roll it in cinnamon, so it looks like a potato, and it's right on the inside. So it's just learn those communities that it had that were kind of took me away from the this is really hard to navigate, or also the fact that I did go so far away from home, couldn't get home as much as I wanted to, right? How do you navigate? Find and hold on to your kid. I would say communities, right? So you have the professors who are helping you. If you're interested in the combination of journalism, visual studies, and Arabic studies, that might say, oh, there's a professor at Brown, or oh, there's a professor at who does that, right? Mm-hmm. Let me put you in contact with an email, right? And so that's how you can continue to build. Sometimes it feels like a very neat, the multitude of interests that you have that come together to be you. There is somebody who isn't you, but they do something similar enough that they can help you navigate it. And so even if the current professor that you are working with was, ride or die for you, is not what you want to do, they may know someone somewhere else who's going to say, come here and do a master's with me, or come here and do a doctorate, or come do an internship, or I just got this grant to study this, come be one of my research assistants, right? And so I think for me, it's those communities.
Yeah, that's something that Claudia talked about.
Yeah,
she has a great network, so
I need to. That's why Claudia's no, Claudia's just a great person. So yeah.
So how important is it, just which college you get into from if you want to go on
So, how important is it which college you get your PhD from if you want to go on to be a professor? I think that depends on what type of professor you want to be, right? I could never see I have friends who are at, and I won't say any names or any names of any institutions, but I have friends who are at elite institutions who are also 38, 39, and their hair is falling out because of, right? I don't want to be that type of professor. I didn't necessarily want it to be at a public institution, but I wanted to be an institution where I could equally focus, I can equally hone that desire for knowledge and research while also my love for teaching and engaging with students, right? And so I think in terms of like the PhD program, it really depends on what type of professor you want to be. You want to get a job at the top university, right? Another thing that I think is important is to find a program and have there's a few things that you're gonna need. One, find a professor who wants to work with you. So if you send an email like inquiring, this is what I want to do, hopefully that their response to you, if they say yes, they will work with you. It's not just, oh sure, I actually have a space for a student, right? It's like, this is really interesting. Have you got like a professor that wants to work with you? I think it's really important. I think funding is super important. Funding is super important. And then even for people who come from backgrounds where they don't have to worry about resources. But sometimes the thing that gets you the next grant is having something already on your CV, right? So I think one of the things for me going to UT to the Latin American Studies program is I got the top African recruitment fellowship, right? That automatically, when I then applied for an outside fellowship in Latin American Studies, I got an outstanding researcher in Latin American Studies, right? And so I think if you can go to a place where you get funding and you can put graduate research award or graduate scholarship or, you know, those things kind of start to help you build your CV. That's also going to be important. I do think it's important to go to a place where, and so I don't think there's like one or two schools that are better, but I also think it's important to go to a place where if you go on the faculty page and look at the CVs, faculty have CVs that look like what you envision your future CV to look like, right? It means that they're going to know how to publish in certain journals. If that's where you see your work landing. They're going to know how to get certain scholarships. If you see, or grants or fellowships. If you want to study something, do you want to give an example of what you might want to study?
Well, I don't know. Right now I'm pretty interested in like psychopharmaceutical medication, contribution, like autonomy.
So you might already know someone who's, because you're gonna have to take books or articles or something, about this, right? Where are those people at, right? How many people at their university do something similar? Because then they might be like, yes, let's not only work with this student, but fund this student, right? So I think the best the PhD program is the one that fits your specific needs.
Yeah, I was scared.
I mean, you can go and I don't think you necessarily have to. It's weird because I went to UT, but I think, and so it's like, oh, you can say that because you went to UT, but I don't think you necessarily have to go to somewhere like super, super top of line, unless you want to end up at one of those super, super, super schools. Well, then maybe yes, but.
No, yeah, it's more like what you said, just
yeah. Sometimes you might find that the people who are doing the work that you really, really are interested in are at the top institutions, and it makes sense you end up there. That's what happened to me. I researched UT. I knew it was a top program in Latin American Studies, but it was really when I saw like professors doing amazing things, human geography, and professors doing research projects and activist research is one of the things that stood out to me, right? And so sometimes you'll find that what you're interested in then leads you to an elite institution, but if not, that's okay. Because yeah, the best support you're going to get is from that professor who's going to be behind you all the way.
And the professor is going to be behind you all the way.
Yeah, it doesn't mean they're going to make it easy for you. Like my first article that I published, like I sent it to my advisor. He sent back some information. It was terrible. Why did I open that email? I was at dinner with my visiting, who she was gonna be traveling in South America for a year, and so this is like the last time she was gonna be in the United States. She came to did stop to visit other family members, and we were at dinner, and I got the email, and I opened it. Why did I open it at table? And I was like. It was my sister, her now husband, who was then her boyfriend, and 3 of my friends at Williams College. We were all like on the job market together and sending out, writing our dissertations and sending out articles together. And so they had come to meet my family, just like the friends I established. And I opened the email, and then I get up and I go in the bathroom, and I must have sat on that toilet and cried for like 30 minutes. because my advisor ripped it to shreds. But it was out of care. And it's like, I don't want you to get a rejection.
Yeah.
You know, and it was accepted, you know, and so I don't want you to rush it. I want this to get in. And this is a person who has been in the field for 30, 40, I'm sorry, I don't know how long, but but a long time, right? Longer than me, and it's done very well, right? And so I cried for 20 minutes, and then I like took my coat, I was like walked by the table, and I walked home, and I texted my husband, and said, please tell my friends I'm so sorry, I can't make words right now. or whatever. But that was an advisor who gave me painful feedback because he wanted my article to be published, you know? And so I think finding that whether it's a professor or an advisor who's gonna have your back, you know, it's gonna just ride or die for you, doesn't mean that they're gonna be like, I'll let this slide, I'll let this slide. It means that they don't want to let go of you and then you fall, right? They want you to be able to continue walking and running and flying, right? And so that's the person you want, not the person who's like, because you're my favorite, sure. You know, you want people who are gonna read and say like, actually how are you saying this is true? You have no evidence, right? Is this actually based on your own biases, right? You want that professor.
Yeah, the closer I get to graduating, that feeling of like criticism, take it way differently. It's way more important now.
It is. It never gets easier to take it. But
No, but you know it's
like
more
that.
valuable suddenly.
You may have to cry it out first, but you come back and you're like, you know what? That's what I need to hear.
It was a few days before I was like, okay, let me pick this up again. But yeah. So,
Wow, I'm done. No.
Were there ever any times that you've had experiences with people where you felt like maybe they were kind of trying to push you out of the space to like your identity? And if so, what was that experience and how did you do it?
there were experiences. So there were lots of experiences. I did not always deal with it in the best way. I think there are opportunities that I could have had that I did not take. So I'll give you one example. When I applied to study abroad in Cuba, I was meeting for someone. I met with someone in the Latin American Studies. Well, you already know school. I'm trying to make this as honest as possible. Basically, I met with someone who I'd taken a class with, and I said, I want to apply for this scholarship to go to Cuba. Would you write me a letter of recommendation? And they told me that it was something along the lines of, well, actually, you don't have enough experience extracurriculars and XYZ, right? You want to actually wait and go for this later. I was also like a junior, so. But it was someone who turned me down for a letter of recommendation, not because I had not done the work in their class. I got an A in their class, and I actually thought I had a good relationship with this person. It was because they didn't think I was the best candidate, right? And I don't know, there could have been a number of reasons, but that was a type of professor that I don't think I did, right? And then there's been like so many. I study Black people in Argentina. I've been in a room at a conference at the University of Buenos Aires with a historian that was like, oh no, they don't exist here. And I'm like historians of Argentina. And so like, I've had so many people say like, oh no, that's not important, right? So there's that kind of like saying that your research isn't important. But then there's also been personal experience that have to do with like who I am. And so how I navigated is I have a bomb-ass group of siblings who are also Black professors who deal with the same things every day. And so we talk to each other. We used to have a back board trip where we just like at the end of the semester, it was over the Christmas break. My sister's birthday is on Christmas. We'd meet somewhere, and this is throughout our doctorates, almost doing a master's. We'd meet somewhere in an international country. Like if I was doing research in Argentina, they were gonna meet in Argentina. My brother was finishing a physics PhD in Germany, we were in Germany, right? But it was a decompressing of like how hard it sometimes is to exist in a space. And I think I was more fortunate, but for my sister who was in like human development and psychology, and my brother who was in theoretical physics, they were often the only other person who was Black, right, in their programs. And so I think for us, I like that decompressing or sharing of stories. And so I've been really fortunate. Here's my mom again. Here's my mom again. I think the fact that my mom has always been so proud of us that she was maybe too proud of us because she was like, I did this like explore pre-med at University of Pittsburgh, where you get to like go around to different hospitals and rounds to see if you want to become a doctor. And she'd be like, my daughter's in med school. And I'm like, Mom, I'm 19, I'm not in med school. Right? So, I had this mom who bragged about us nonstop, right? And so I think because I have a strong, successful family, but then also it's like growing up, I've been like, oh, Jesus, amazing. We grew up in the place we grew up in West Oakland. When I grew up, it was like the crack epidemic and it was like the murder capital of the world every year. But before that, it was where the Black Panther Party was founded. So there was an intellectual community there. So like there were books. I remember when I was like super young and I loved to read, and I was like, Mom, I need a book. Can you take me to the library? And I said, can you take me to Barnes and Noble at Jack London Square? And she said, go read a book on your bookshelf. And I was like, I've read them all. And then my dad gave me Orson Scott Card. It's how I fell in love with science fiction. And my mom gave me a book on the history of Albany. And so like, it was like, I think that because I've always had like a really like supportive family, a lot of those moments never turned into, well, I give up. And so, yeah. My mom also has this thing when she does, well, she says like, if somebody tells you can't do it, we're gonna go back and do it. She's like, 5 minutes of prayer could be 5 hours of like trying to figure it out. And she will like sit with me and pray for 5 minutes. Yeah, so she's always been like, you can do anything.
So I guess being here at UNR, you said you came here in 2020. During that time, there was also, I'm not sure what part of 2020 you came, but there were also like, protests going on in Reno. What was that like coming from, coming to a new city, having all that going on? And then knowing that you were soon going to be teaching some of these students who are out there protesting. What was that like?
Yeah, so I came in July. It was June 30th, July, so a lot of the protests had already happened. I think one of the things for me was, I also came from Williamstown. And so I think one of the things that for me was that kind of really stood out is that I came from a town that is, it's a Williamstown, Massachusetts. Unless the students are there, it's a predominantly white, wealthy town. And they had a protest that was staged by the high school students, where there's like, the town it's one street, it's maybe 2 miles long. There's a roundabout that takes you outside the town. And they staged a die-in after George Floyd was murdered at the roundabout. It was something that I had expected. Also, keep in mind that before I came from Williamstown, I come from Argentina, where there's a lot of protests, but it was the strangest protest that I've ever participated in, because, people were taking up street space and the police were simply just like escorting people around so as not to disrupt the protest, right? Which is completely different than what you were seeing was happening in Oakland, in Los Angeles, and right, this is complete further disregard for Black lives. And so when I came to Reno, I think that's what I knew that I was coming to a place where it wouldn't be as easy to stand up and say, this is wrong, right? And I think a lot of that had to do with who the demographics of the protesters were in that area and who they were, right? Police are a lot less likely to trample over a bunch of rich white high school students than they are people, you know what I mean? And so that was one of the things. And so with regards to how I kind of approached the moment in terms of teaching, honestly, it was difficult because I was also experiencing in the trauma, right? I remember talking with a group of friends, a multiracial group of friends, I'll say, and one of the persons was asking like, this seems like it's really, really hitting Black people very hard. And my other friend, he said to her, he asked her if we're older, so the answer was yes, but do you remember what it felt like? Do you remember what September 11th felt like? We all grieved, but not all of us knew someone who had lost their life, what it felt like. And he's like, that's what it feels like for the Black community every time someone's course it's a collective, you know, it could happen to you, to your brother, to your sister. And so like watching those moments is not just watching that at those moments. It's also the time that my brother was skateboarding to class and got stopped by the police. The numerous times that my nephews have gotten pulled over by the police. One of my nephews lives in a neighborhood that's all white, and he drives so that I'm gonna get home and has gotten stopped multiple times, right? And so for me, I think the important thing for me, I was thinking, I have to be okay, because I was also not in a great place. And that's what I said, I hiked every weekend, and that's what saved me. It was saving me not just from the pandemic and not knowing it. I'm a very social person. That's not gonna be hard, you know, whether it's like, you know, getting on, making the vision board with my friends on Zoom or whatever. That was what I needed to save my mental health from, was that moment, right? And so I think for me, I think my goal was to be there for students, to say, I acknowledge that even though you have to go back to school right now, there are multiple crises happening right now. So this is also the same time that when I was moving here to work, we had all this data on the disparities and health inequality that were affecting people of color disproportionately from the pandemic. Also the pandemic, also the murder of the people are still being murdered if they're Black, right? And so there's just kind of, I saw what I call a triple crisis was happening. And so I was like, for me, students need to know that I know that that's real, and I'm feeling it too. And so students need to know that I can be flexible, you know? Because I think that's how I approached teaching that semester. I only taught one class, but it was hard. It was very hard. So I don't know if that answers your question. Okay, yes. Yeah.
So, I know as a Black student coming here in 2018, it was like a huge change. And one of my huge gripes that I complained about all the time was there was no minor for Latinx or African American studies. And now we're gonna have one. I'm graduating. So we did, right? Like, I missed it. But I kind of wanted to ask you, like, what was the process and everything that happened? Did you just come here and you saw that there was a need for it, and so you're like, I'm going to provide that? Or was it kind of like they saw you and they were like, we can help make this happen?
So this actually started as far back as my interview process. So it was something that was expressed by the dean and the chairs of my different departments. Like, one of the things that we're going to do is create this minor and maybe eventually a major. That's something you would be interested in. Yes, I'm on it. Well, I think first I was like, what? You don't have not even a minor? But I was like, okay, yes, if students want them, I'm here for it, right? So the process, which is interesting because it was my first semester, and so I'm trying to like get a lot of things off the ground, but there weren't even, we need to create courses for them, right? We still may not have enough people to teach all these courses that we need, right? But I did have a lot of support from my two chairs. Like, if I was like because the Black Studies minor exists in the Generation Identity department. And so if I was working really hard to get 2 or 3 syllables cranked out, plus a proposal for a Black Studies minor in one department, my other chair was like, okay, I'm gonna give you a small silver role so you can still get this, but officially you can recognize your service in this department. Like, they were really good. And it was almost like that, how are you doing? Are you doing okay? And so I think the support that I got, and there was one point where I was like, I kind of like tried to put my head on, like, what is it called when you tuck your head? Basically, I'd gone for a while and I hadn't produced anything. And this is something we wanted to get off the books, but I was just so overwhelmed with everything that was going on. And I was like, it's okay, what do you need? And so like, I actually had a lot of support coming here. And so one of the things that was also my motivation for making sure that I was a part of this process is it kind of goes back to that experience that I had after I got back from Cuba. And people were saying, oh, there's Black people in Cuba. These are Black people saying there's Black people in Cuba, right? And so, or just, Black people speak Spanish, right? And so I think I hope that most people know by now, but 15 years ago when I was finishing undergraduate and second abroad and stuff, people did, for some reason, and I studied Latin American studies, I know, but for some reason people didn't know that only about 7 to 10% of the people who are brought across the ocean in the transatlantic slave trade arrived to the Americas. the vast majority of arrived to countries in Latin America, Brazil, the Caribbean, even up until the 1630s, Veracruz, Mexico was the major port for enslaved people to arrive, right? And so these histories exist in all parts. Not only that, contemporary experiences right now. When I was in Barcelona, I met with a Senegalese mutual aid society. I went and met with a Black women's theater group, right? I thought that, one of the things for me, and I think this is also a reflection of the fortune I had to study decolonial studies, to study activist research at the University of Texas, is that I recognize that even now, and even I'm a part of this, there's a hegemony on who is producing knowledge about what Blackness means globally, right? And it is coming, a lot of it is coming from the American North. And so, or even sometimes Western Europe, right? I didn't want that narrative to be what Blackness was here. I wanted to create a minor that is attuned to the experiences of Africans and the African diaspora, right? And so the courses that I've designed, so it's not for nothing that there's one of the courses is Afro-Latinx communities in the United States. The Black epistemologies and ways of seeing, of course, has philosophers from Brazil, from Colombia, from Nigeria, right? And so I think for me, like, one of the things that I wish that more Black studies majors around the country had was a transnational perspective. And so I saw this as an opportunity to plant the seeds of the Black Studies program that I would like to see grow or exist out of. So it was a wonderful experience. Huh?
Just getting to build it.
Yeah, I think I don't think and I hope not, because you don't want one person's ideas and experience or perspective to build something that you hope reaches a number of people, right? But I hope that now the seeds have been started. And so I actually, even when I was building, it was a wonderful experience. Even when I was working on it, I reached out to other professors who were doing work. They started reading them to suggest even the name of the course, and this is my chance to give Professor Nikki Garlick, who's in the Justice Management Program, a shout out, said like, oh, you should call it Black Epistemologies and Ways of Seeing. That's that's going to be the one of the primary courses. Gave me that title, and so like, it was a labor of love, and it was one that I was not able to complete without like the input of so many people, and I wouldn't have done it the other way. But it was a great experience. So I hope it grows. I hope we have lots of people who enroll. I hope we have lots more professors who design courses and teach courses, and I hope we always continue to think that our experience, as whether we're Black Americans, whether we are Black Brazilians, that our experience of Blackness is not the only experience, and if we're going to do a Black Studies course, we should have our major, that should be a part of it.
I know you're graduating. I'm not sure who authorized that. Because you were well earned it, but perhaps PRSA, the next generation of students, can do a promotion of the course.
That would be great. I would love it.
This is really, and I'm Allison Golden, the faculty advisor.
So nice to meet you.
This is the PR club, and one of the things we have two roles. Dahlia's role, I think is the DEI officer and to expose us to all kinds of. But we also do have a student in charge of community relations, and we're trying to do for community on campus. We could easily take this on as a project in the fall.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's put it in the notes. I have to go. I have a date.
And I love the color.
I was surprised to see you. I was like, she must have something going on.
Well, I made it connect. So I appreciated this. I learned something every time. So
Thank you
I'll
so
see
much.
you on campus. Bye, kids.
Have a good
nice
one.
day.
What is the requirements for that? And like, how long would it take to complete the minor? And then I have another question about.
Hold on, we went later.
And then I have another question about, so like I've done, for my media ethics class, I had done a presentation about how Black people are addressed in the media. And I honestly, it was a very simple presentation to do, but then I spent like 3 hours and then some doing research, because as I was doing the presentation, I was like, I don't know how to identify us. Some people don't want to be called African American, some people don't want to be called Black because monolith, they see it as a monolithic term. And so like, are you going to address that in the minor, like how to like where a Black comes from and like how to identify ourselves?
Yeah, wow. So I think there's a couple of things in terms of addressing how to identify ourselves. That is something that is in debate, right? It's exactly what you said. Not everybody sees themselves as Black. I'll tell you why why we are calling that Black Studies. And a lot of that has to do with situating it in specific epistemologies. And that's what this first course does, epistemologies of experiences that are tied to colonialism, right? And that experience exists for Black people, whether or not you're in the US, whether you're in Brazil, whether you're in Germany, and whether you're on the African continent. So we know that many of the countries there were colonized, right? And not only that, even where you have countries that did not have an experience of colonization, just very few, they are still red, right? And there's a scholar, Nancy Lopez, who talks about your street race, right? Their experiences are filtered through a global system, right? And so that's where that comes from. It doesn't mean that everybody has to follow themselves Black. My research is in Argentina, and I will even tell you one of the, it's an ongoing debate within the social movement I study, but you will see that a lot of their programming or the institute they're trying to get funded is called the National Institute for Afro-Argentines, Afro-Descendants, and Africans, because there's a large African immigrant population there. There's Afro-Descendants from other parts of the world, and then Afro-Argentines have a unique experience because people didn't know they existed for so long, right? Even though they always have since the colonial era, right? And so for them, it's not enough just to say the Institute for Asuntos Afro, like this Institute for Black Issues. It's not enough to say the Institute for Afro-Descendant Issues, right? In that context, and I think the key word here is context. In that context, the key thing was to have an institute that can address the three specificities there. Afro-descendants who have migrated, Afro-Argentine experiences, which are unique, and African immigrant experience. So the African immigrant experience in Argentina is in the last up to 20 years, 90s is when you started to have a Senegalese and Congolese population immigrate, where police violence against Black people has become something in Argentina that happens regularly, and it's mostly against Africans, right? It's not against a lot of Afro-Argentines who are often, not all the time, but often are mixed race, right? And people say, oh, you don't say that, you're white, just say you're white, right? So I don't think it's my job to tell people how to self-identify. I think one of the things that becomes important is to look at the why, right? Sometimes it is based on racialized history. And then even for myself, I think context isn't, so I identify as Black, right? But I don't know if you remember in the class the other day, we were having a conversation and the reading says Black and Puerto Rican women. And I said, actually, I'm gonna say African-American and Puerto Rican women because there's a lot of Puerto Ricans who are Black as well. This is to say Black and Puerto Rican would automatically assume that Puerto Rican is Black, right? And so I think context matters as well. And so with the Black Studies minor or the courses, I can speak for myself. I'm never going to say to someone, you have to say you're Black, right? Or you have to say you're African American, right? A lot of that comes out of a very specific experience. So,
I like when I was doing that research, I just felt like a lot of the papers were about. And yeah, and like it took a while, like going through the UNR database, like well before I went through the UNR database to find like actual Black professors who were writing this paper. But like that like kind of ignited an interest. I actually had to organize like a group discussion with the Black student organization from the African diaspora, and then we got into that topic of how do we label ourselves. And, so like it got me interested in kind of doing research for how journalists can properly identify people who are identify as Black or who are obviously going to be recognized as Black, but then identify as like Trinidadian American, something like that. So yeah, like in the Black Studies minor, would it be possible to like kind of do that research of how journalists can properly identify?
yeah, possible and encouraged, right? And one of the things that I would say, and this is something I hold to myself, is don't be too rigid. Don't decide on something. And so to explain that further, when I started my research in Argentina in 2012, there were not a lot of people in Argentina saying I'm Black. and my research was called the Afro-descendant social movement in Argentina. And that was actually a term, and there's also levels to this. So in 2001, there was a third World Conference Against Racism that happened in Durban, South Africa. Black activists from all over the world met at that conference to come up with a list of demands to improve the life of the African diaspora around the globe. And there was a big debate. How do we define ourselves? Are we Black? And we said, well, I'm not Black. I'm a person of color, but I'm not Black, right? That means something different. That means something different depending on where you are. Afro-descendants from Latin America showed up in Peru. There was a lot who showed up at that conference. And they came up with Afro-descendant as a political term because, and this is especially important in places where there's a lot of Black invisibility, where a lot of people say, well, yes, I have African descent. I'm of African descent, but I'm not Black, right? So it's part of their strategy to mobilize the communities to stand up for their rights and to recognize them, right? But even there, you have this is a bunch of Black intellectuals and activists coming together, and it's not necessarily reaching the everyday experiences of people who are not involved in those movements, right? And so I think for me, it's important to not be too rigid, right? And so when I was first started studying the experience of Afro-Argentines or Black people living in Argentina, I thought I was going there and I was studying Black people. Then when I learned that they were saying Afro-descendant and why it was important for them, and if you look at my papers, you'll see I was writing Afro-descendants in Argentina, right? It's been the last maybe, trying to think, so at least since 2016, but possibly a little bit longer, where Black women have a line behind a Black decolonial anti-racist feminist stance that there's been even a push in Argentina that said to identify as Native or Black, right? That is still in context, right? But now, because so more people are saying that, and of course, again, for political reasons, right? I have been using the word Black, but I also sometimes it depends. Even if you when I write, I also identify the person how they self-identify, right? So if I'm writing on, these are anonymized names, but Tatiana identifies as Afrodescendiente. That is how she says, "Yo soy una mujer afrodescendiente." I am writing in my research, and I clarify this, Tatiana, an Afro-descendant woman from Minas Gerais, right? But if I'm interviewing Sula, who says I am una mujer negra, I will say Sula, a Black woman from Minas Gerais, right? Mm-hmm. And so I also I honor people's experiences and their, I don't say like, oh, you just don't know what you are, right? And so I really welcome that as part of that whole not trying to have an agenda on what Blackness is, that I think Black Studies program.
Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to kind of provoke the conversation with journalists is that we need to be more attentive to that instead of trying to lump everybody together. Because if you interview a group of students who are all different types of Afro-descendants, and you just say that they're all Black, then you're kind of ignoring their identity. And that's the issue that I think is very present in a lot of newsrooms, of course, because they're mostly white. But in that discussion with the Black Student Organization, we kind of came to a group decision that if we were to move past Black, Afro, putting Afro in front of more inclusive, because a lot of the students in the Black Student Organization who were there at that discussion were from Africa, they were from Ghana, Nigeria, and then even in high school, I went to most of the Black kids in my program were Ethiopian, and we talked about that at the discussion about how Ethiopians will often not identify as Black until it benefits them with scholarships, and so that's another disparity is that I want to explore is Africans who don't identify as Black because they see it as a threat. Because that's something that I came across a lot in high school, and it's a very interesting topic that I'd like to explore, and obviously would like to talk to you about.
Yeah, definitely. I would also suggest that you speak with another professor in diverse identity and sociology as well, Dr. Badrika Etienne, who studies the Badrika, Badricka. Sorry, Badrika, I'm not information, but I know you want to study. Etienne, Etienne. Dr. Etienne studies the experiences of 1.5 and second generation Haitian Americans and how they maintain culture. There's those questions too. I also have a a colleague, and really good friend, Shanti Tosado, who is at the University, at Rutgers University, who studies the experiences of Afro-Dominicans and Afro-Puerto Ricans, and how they, when, why, and how they identify as Black or don't identify as Black, right? And so it is something that there are scholars, there are Black scholars doing that work, you know, African scholars doing that work, and you can find their work. And I think if you look at a much more nuanced exploration of the wins, whys, and how that happened.
Okay, one of my questions is, so my partner is of Latino descent, not Black at all. And being someone who is in college, and I'm an ethnic studies minor because I wanted to learn more about marginalized communities. How do you go about being a woman of color in academia and trying to have conversations with people who are not in academia? And so you'll try to talk about different topics and they'll tell you that you're wrong. And you don't want to tell them like, hey, you know, actually I'm not, because there's several sources that support this, because based on their experiences, they have not experienced that, but even though you've met other people who've had those experiences. So how do you navigate that, talking to people who aren't in academia and how they just think like, oh, she just thinks she's better than us because she has a doctorate and has gone to school.
You really want to know this one too?
I think, and this is probably not the news you want to hear, but I'm still navigating it. It's something that's not going to go away. I think patience. I think humility is important, and especially for someone going to say you're wrong. I think if there's this you're wrong, nothing's going to happen anyway. But I try not to retaliate whether you're wrong. Right? So one of the ways, I'll come back to patience, but one of the ways that I do try to navigate that is by asking questions, right? And sometimes it'll be it's a, well, have you ever heard of, and then it's sharing the experience that it's not that person's, right? But that may be similarly tired, right? Or, but what about, or, you know, but what about someone's there, you know what I mean? And so that, and actually, I think that happens a lot with, in the Latinx community, where you talking about Afro-Latin what that looks like, right? There's a number of Afro-Latinx scholars who are doing really good work to kind of break down some of those barriers and norms. But even I think, you know, and the scholarship is just using cultural icons to kind of break down those norms, right? And so I think, how do I navigate that is one with patience, humility, and asking open questions. Just how I want to, one of the reasons why I'm driven by learning is that I want to I know that like lights flicker on in multiple places when I have something that's outside of my experiences and realm of knowledge. And it's a light flickering in a period of growth. I think that exists for a lot of people. And doesn't mean that you have to want to be a lifelong learner, right? But I think those moments of where you discover something that exists outside of what you know is true, you grow all of it. And so I think one of a great way is asking those open questions. You know, have you heard of this? You know, but I think it's going to be a constant process. But then I also think that humility, and I think the humility is important because it is important for us to not think we know more than people because we have a doctorate, right? So I may know more about what Patricia Hill Collins says about the matrix of domination, but it doesn't mean that I know more about what Afro-descendant women who have lived in Argentina know what it means to be Black in Argentina, right? And so I think that humility is also a part too, where we are not only asking questions, but listening. And the last thing I'll say is that some people don't deserve your time in trying to explain this. And so that's hard to say, right? Because sometimes we have family members who are right, with people that we love, right? But I think sometimes you can only give so much of your energy to that. And I think at some point you have to say, okay, this is not something that we just have to worry about. It's unfortunate, but it's kind of the way.
Yeah. Because what are you gonna get going around this circle?
Thank you for adding that again, because you want it type to be constructive and yes, and as much as you can, but at a certain point, we have a family from Southeast Missouri, the Ozarks, and we're just never, some things we're just never gonna be on the same page about. And so eventually I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
we'll never, all right.
There's people in my family who my close family and extended family who are very conservatively religious, and there's some things that, try as I may. Actually, I will say that over the last 10 years, one probably heard it, but I think that sometimes there is like a person in my family asked me the other day if I could understand what it means to be non-binary. This is the person before who like, I lost you to gender stuff. So
Yeah.
I think that it's hard, right? Because we have people that we love dearly. And for one reason or another, they want to prove to you why you're wrong.
It's heartbreaking that some people can't just accept a point of view that they can't wrap their head around,
And I totally get that, because the Ozarks is like a 2-hour drive from my family. So having conversations with them is like, for instance, I went to go visit them for the first time in 5 or 6 years in 2020, in the middle of summer, which was June, like the beginning of June. And they didn't know who I had become. Like, they didn't know the type of person that I was. And so they were asking me questions about so how do you feel about brutality and things like that? And how I felt about the Black Lives Matter movement. And mind you, on my aunt's side, because she's my mom's half sister, her oldest brother is a police officer. And so there's obviously that intersectionality going on. And basically, because she basically told me, like, I am a little bit biased because I know plenty of good officers. And I said to her, well, basically, my opinion is I'm not going to say that all officers are bad just because they're officers. What I will say is this, that doesn't mean that all officers are good either. And I was like, at the end of the day, that's their profession. Their biases and their racism and everything can still come out. Just because that person picked this profession doesn't mean that they're.
We all have biases.
Yeah.
You can't avoid them unless you grew up in a bubble where you don't know how to speak or do anything else, right? And so
even Supreme Court justices.
Especially, I do want to. I think you asked me about like what the requirements for the Black Studies. My phone is dead, but I believe it's 18 credits. There's a couple of core courses, so the Black Personality and Ways of Seeing. One of the flagship GRI courses, so either 103, which is intersectional analysis of identities, and the other you could take that or race and authority life, and then you would take one of the 2 level courses. And then a lot of it is elective, so you would get to choose. And one of the things that I think that I wouldn't say we miss, but one of the things I think that would be very interesting is an integration of the Arabic world, or even the MENA countries, right?
I'm the director of the department. She would be really interested in that because I
The director of journalism?
No, Eric.
Eric, okay.
Yeah, her name is Dahlia.
DWEDAR.
But she's definitely interested in having more than just people who are interested in going to the military. Because that's her entire
Really?
experience she's ever had throughout the
Oh, yeah,
entire experience she's taken. And like I'm working with her now, I'm like, getting her in contact with Tanya to like get more journalism students in the department. But she would love that because, yeah, I think even she would be interested in exploring like Afro history in Egypt. She's from Egypt.
Exactly, and look at that goosebumps. They're some of the most beautiful novels I've ever read in literature. She's a professor of Arabic studies. She's in the UK now, but she's a literary scholar, and so she's like, "Oh yeah, you can read this novel." She has some of their translated. She just teaches her classes, and I was like, "We are missing out on a rich history and and even, creative fiction that comes out. 'Cause a lot of fiction is social commentary that comes out of histories, right? But she studies the Andalus. So, the symbol of the Andalus, do you know what that is? It's so fascinating. It's this symbol in MENA countries that has a number of meanings. So you'll see, it's actually what Andalusia, Spain is named after, but it has a number of meanings. So she studies different meanings it has, and she studies that through novels. I'm like, yeah, I could read. She said, oh, this was a 3-part series. The only one has been the book she gave me. Oh, only the first one was translated. I'm like, what? What happens? And so it is a language that unfortunately, because of global militarism and the foreign interest of our country right now, Arabic studies in the United States is highly codified. It should be, because that's the last thing you want, right? Is you want people to have multiple understandings if your goal is mutual understanding, right? So.
Yeah, and I'm going to grad school to focus on research studies because my long-term goal is to work in the Middle East film documentary about the diversity because it's so diverse. Like there's one class, and I was like. I was like, I've always been interested in Arabic. How diverse this was, and then even just in the Middle East, like there's so much negative connotation behind that word. So like I've been speaking with one of my former professors about doing research on changing the Middle East and like how we can change that name to be more inclusive to the diversity.
Yeah, I think I use MENA. I think some people use the MENA, Middle Eastern North African countries or. But it's interesting because even some people will think of MENA with a negative connotation, right? So that we need more people doing the work to show these different histories and diversity of this place. It's a long road, but I think you should let people doing. But so much of it's interesting. So I don't know if you know anything about how much Arabic has influenced Spanish language, because the more
that's
history,
that's
right?
what she talks about. She you had said something about how you brought the cultural aspect to the language, the Spanish language. She does that, and that's what I love about her. And it was unfortunate because I could not learn the language online during it was too hard. But she fully immerses you in the culture as you're learning the language, and she kind of forms the language like Lego blocks, so it's so easy to build on top of it.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that students in the military are learning Arabic because they will hopefully go with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because the military trains people in Arabic with just what do you call it, the Rosetta Stone or something like that, just to learn the language and let you know anything about the culture, and so it doesn't have to actually break down any predisposition or stereotypes. So, yeah, but with so much of our our accounting system, math that we use every day comes out of the world. So. One other thing is that we do, because we're an interdisciplinary program, we do recognize that what we list in the major cannot possibly cover what we hope our students are interested in. And so there is a course that you can take, which is basically it's not an independent study course, but you register for the course and you take a class that you want to take, and as long as so let's say you were taking an upper level Arabic course, and you wanted to apply to a Black Studies minor. You would then meet with the advisor and say, I'm taking this course, which is called, let's say, Contemporary Novels in the Arabic World, right? But my final paper are on these 3 Black writers. That can count towards the Black Studies minor. Yes, as long as you're learning about that. I don't remember how many courses you could apply through that way, but a lot of them we could.
Is your Black epistemology class, can that be like a, so I'm in a sociology class that's also GRI.
Yes.
So would that be like GRI and also you read Mill, there was this huge flat space of Black philosophers. But then that's all we read, and then we don't actually read Black philosophers.
It's interesting. It's so it's interesting because even for some of the ones that I try to find, There's a number of amazing Black philosophers whose work is in French that I can't find from, either like maybe Algeria or even Martinique. There are scholars in Latin America whose work have been translated, philosophers. So it's sometimes hard to get access. And then there's like African scholars who produce work in English and it's just not publicly available here. I might have to like go to Uganda and through the archive and make a photocopy, right? And so that is unfortunate. It's something that we're not right now. One of my future goals is to get a grant to digitize or to make available more. In terms of the Black epistemologies and ways of seeing that course, and you'll see that a lot of my courses are cross-listed, is because I teach in both departments. But that course is actually super interdisciplinary. So there are philosophers on there who are Black, but there are also sociologists and historians. But it's basically, and the reason why I thought when Dr. Garland told me, oh, why don't you call it Black epistemologies, ways of seeing, because it's not only just about philosophy, but the whole premise of epistemology is who can be a knower, right? And what are the different ways that we can see it? And I don't only think you need to look at those questions, and so that course is very interdisciplinary.
Yeah, it would be nice if the philosophy department.
If they would accept it.
Yeah, it would just be like.
I don't think we
diverse.
enough
Yeah.
classical philosophy. Yeah. Let's push them to do something, or at least add, if they want 2 or 3 people to add to their songs.
Yeah.
I'm gonna ask one last question to wrap up everything, because I know we have to get home. It's Friday, weekend.
I'm gonna work when I I'm gonna eat and breathe. Yeah, this is about the last, it doesn't stop until free time. What is it?
So my final question is, as a person of color, sometimes in being in an interracial relationship, sometimes I feel guilt because I just want to learn all about Blackness, all about Black culture, all the time, because I feel like I was deprived of it growing up in, a predominantly white town. But also being a woman of color in academia and having a doctorate, you're teaching a variety of students who come from a variety of backgrounds. So how do you go about navigating that, maybe that guilt that you may feel sometimes when you feel like, am I making other people who are marginalized or have their own cultures and histories feel like they're not being heard of just because I'm Black, and so obviously I would focus on these things.
It's interesting because I don't know necessarily that I want to focus on them because I'm Black. So like for example, I teach a course called Social Movements, Gender, Race, and Identity. And I actually didn't even design that course. But if you study radical movements of the 60s, the civil rights movement kicked it off, right? And so you start with that. But I do think it's important to not only always center myself. And so my goal with the courses I design, if it's Black studies, that's a particular type of course, right? But my goal with what I teach is not to make everything about Black studies, for example. And so even, for example, when I teach qualitative methods, or I teach a course that's just social movements, right? In that course, we have a whole section on the Arab Spring, right? I want to teach the stories that you're not going to get in a traditional class. I want to teach the stories that people are craving to hear that are about the non-normative experiences, right? And so if it's a Black studies class, yes, it's going to be focused on the African diaspora and the global, right? But if it's not, I'm bringing multiple experiences. So the course I teach on social movements, gender, race, and identity, we have a section on Chicana feminism, a section on Indigenous feminism, a section on Black feminisms, a section on Asian American feminisms, right? I think all of those stories are important. And so I don't actually ever feel guilt. What I feel is a place from which to encourage others. So what I mean by that is I've got experience of the only time you ever learn about Black history. You've taken a course on Black history, even though Black history is American history, right? That feeling is the same reason why it's so interesting for me to also learn about the Chicago. Maybe, and I say this to people, I might try to Latinx as well. That desire to know about my history, perhaps you have that desire too, right? And so that we recently, Dahlia knows this, but we recently watched a film called No Activists that tells the story of, well, this happened to 20,000 women of color in California. But over the course of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s to the 70s, when it stopped, and I don't guess, we know it still happens some way, women of color were being forcibly sterilized without their knowledge, right? And it's so interesting because my partner is very interested in what I teach, but we were watching that course last year. You were in that course together, and that was actually the first time I'd seen it. And was just completely shocked because he was born and raised in LA. His mother's Mexican immigrant. So, and he thought like, I could ask my mom about this. And then after a while, he couldn't. This is so important to know. It was like, I don't even want her to have to ask that question because she never had another kid after my sister, right? And so it was just like, but that history, like learning about that, excited him about it, right? And so when I, whether I'm teaching or talking about Black history, I never frame it from the standpoint that this is important about Black history. I frame it as this is important because this is the history they don't want us to know, so they can maintain it. And that history is not Black history. It's poor people's history, it's Black history, it's Indigenous people's history, Latinx history. And so I don't actually feel guilt when I teach about Black studies. I feel like, hey, I'm studying this. If there's something that is more tied to your personal experience, go study it. Use it as your final project. I even told a student, I think we're not in class anymore, but there's a student who said, I want to do a comparison. So in our class, they compare a previous movement to a current movement. And the student wanted to do a social movement in Africa. Although the course is about, and I said, okay, the course it's US 19th, 20th century movements, but you could study, you know why? Because there was transnational conversations happening here. You can study the divest, sanction, and boycott movement that was a transnational movement between South African activists and activists in the United States, right? So I don't ever want to shut down a student what they're interested in because it doesn't necessarily fit into the mold, right? Some things you have to like, so kind of this sort of syllabus structure doesn't, so you can actually grade it into the rubric. But I always encourage people to find other things that are I think important. So.
I have a question. How do you kind of, I feel like this day and age students, because of social media and just the like constant access to information, we're kind of, some students are less encouraged to further do extra research outside of class and beyond just getting a grade. How do you encourage your students to take up that exploration, not just for the grade, but for themselves?
Yeah. To some extent, I can only dictate the students so much of their lives, but I require it. So whether you are taking a 100 level course with me, a 200 level course with me, or a 400 level course with me, you gotta come up with what you want to say for your content. And like one of the things that you don't want to say, like, go research 80 articles and write this paper on it. They have to also read that at the same time they're reading for weekly, right? And so I'll say, you can have 5 from syllabus and then take 5 from here and go write about it. Or just read one book, if that's all you do. You get to pick the book, tie it back to this, right? I think that's what for your semester, right? For they chose a book on whatever social movement they want to read about. Here are some ideas. If there's one you want to read that's not on this list I give you, just get it approved with me. If it's about a social movement, you can do it, right? It comes back to the SLOs, which is learning about social movements. You're going to tie it to what you're learning in this class, right? And so for me, I require you to like, I don't like the idea of students only like learning what the professor, so much is about your own exploration of knowledge. How are you going to become a critical thinker if everything you think is what I told you to think, right? And so I actually require it for my classes. And I think I know it's work, but I think it's a good model to get students, especially when you get to choose what you want to learn about. Yeah. So you're gonna like, how do you think I spent? It's hard to be a Black person in Argentina. I have men approach me all the time and ask me if I'm a prostitute. I have kids on trains who make fun of my hair or my nose. They say racism doesn't exist there, right? But I've never been made more aware of the fact that I'm Black than I am in Argentina. It's hard to do that. why do I come? I chose that topic. I'm passionate about elucidating this social system that people say, we're all white here, so how can there possibly be racism, which is in and of itself a racist statement, right? And so I think that when you give students the opportunity to learn about something that they want to learn about, they're going to be, you know, and unfortunately, the only reason they're not even more is because you're taking 5 or 6 classes and God forbid you should have an extracurricular activity and it's COVID, you can't get into a library, right? So I do recognize that as well. It's unfortunate. I want every single student that I teach to get an A, and we have busy lives, and I do recognize that. But if you're gonna have to spend the little hours that you have doing research, I want it to be on something that you're interested in. Thank you so much, everyone.